Hi, I'm Professor Steve Gedeon, and welcome to tool number 2, building your dashboard and journaling. Today I'm coming from downtown Toronto, big surprise, in front of City Hall. Every company has to measure the things that are important to them, and what gets measured gets done. So because cash is king, cash is the oxygen that keeps your company alive, you have to track your cash. It's kind of obvious. That's why we have accounting and finance. But if you can't do good record keeping and you can't track your cash and do accounting, you really shouldn't be in business at all. Another thing that's important for a lot of businesses is tracking your billable hours, especially if you're in consulting, that you bill your time out. And if you can't keep track of what you're spending your time on, you really shouldn't be in consulting. If billable hours are important, you got to track your billable hours. If you're a lawyer, you have to track every 6-minute increments. That's every 0.1 hour. Me, I usually track my time on the hourly basis if I'm billing to clients, or sometimes on the half-day basis or something like that. You have to track and measure your key success factors in any business. It could be number of new customers, it could be customer satisfaction, it could be your churn rate, it could be number of visitors, it could be your click-through rates. If you're in the pharmaceutical industry, it could be things related to your number of new patents, or maybe the number of drugs that have made it through to clinical phase 2 or phase 3 trials or something like that. If you're starting up a new business and you're trying to raise financing, you have to do good record keeping and have a due diligence binder. A due diligence binder is all that stuff that says, I know it's important to investors, and so I'm tracking this stuff. And it could be things like copies of all of our contracts. It could be copies of all of your non-disclosure agreements. It could be tracking and making sure that you have copies of non-competition clauses for all of your employees. That investors care about this stuff. If you can't track the things that are important, you shouldn't be in business. The same thing is true in your life and in your career, that what gets measured gets done. So if you're worried about your weight, for example, you should track your weight, and you should track things like how much exercise you're doing, or what you're eating or drinking, or calories and things like that. If you're worried about your finances, then you should track how much money you're spending. You should track how much money you're saving. And if you're struggling to be in control of your spending habits, you might want to track things on a more microscopic basis to find out, where's all my money going? We have all kinds of health monitoring apps and sleep monitoring apps and monitoring of your screen time, that if something's important to you and you're trying to change it, then you have to measure that. On the other hand, if something's going well for you and the status quo is working, then you probably don't have to track it as much. So, a big question to ask is, are you fine-tuning your life, or are you trying to make major changes? Me, I'm into the fine-tuning stage of my life. And so, here's something that I keep track of some of my things in. We can see that on a day-by-day basis, I'm tracking things like how much time am I spending in the sunshine, because I'm really trying to track my vitamin D production. That's an important part of my health and my happiness, and spending time in the sun is important to me, so I'm tracking that. I'm tracking how much stretching I'm doing. I'm tracking how much water I'm drinking. I'm tracking what kind of exercise I'm getting, or whether I'm doing things that are good for myself. I'm also tracking my progress on my ability to finish all of these entrepreneurial career and life design modules. I've got like 30 of these things to do over a fairly tight time period. And so I'm making sure that I'm making sufficient progress on a day-to-day basis so that I know that I'm on top of things. Kind of a bit of an old school timekeeper or time tracker, if you will, but this works better for me than electronic apps. So step 1 in tool number 2 is buying a journal. Buy something that you enjoy interacting with, and something that you can carry around with you on the bus or the subway or things like that. So here's an example of a series of journals that I have. This is a journal format that I discovered in Venice. It's got some nice Venetian paper. This is journal number 31, and I track things like, here we go, I've got all of my goals that I track here with a little tickler thing in it. This is some new habits I'm trying to work on around cues for drinking water. I read a interesting book. This is Jordan Peterson's 12 Rules of Life, and so I made a little note in this and and wrote down some of the things that I liked about it. A lot of things that I didn't like about Jordan Peterson's book. He's got some interesting things to say. He's obviously a very articulate person, but I certainly don't agree with everything that he says. But there's some stuff in here that I thought were pretty good. I'm also tracking things like the cocktails that I've been making. So whenever I find a new one that I really like, I track what it is and I give it a grade. I'm tracking things like some of the research topics that I'm thinking about working on. I track the books that I've read. I've just finished book number 12 for this calendar year. I see that I read 16 books last year. So this is just a good format. It's got a hard cover, so like you can write with it sitting on your lap. It's got good quality paper so that it absorbs the ink and doesn't smear around. Anyway, it took me a while to find a journal that works really well for me. And when you got 20, 30 of them in a bookshelf, these kind of look nice. So that's an example of a journal. I'm suggesting that you buy this journal primarily to track your ideas and your self-talk and your emotional responses to things, and not to use it so much as a diary of just stuff that happened to you. So I would have hundreds of these things if I tracked everything that was going on in my life. That's more for kind of like a calendar or a day timer or something like that. And I throw these away from year to year. Sometimes I keep them if there's important things in it. So I'm not using this for day to day what happened to me as much as the important things related to ideas, self-talk, brainstorming around goals, tracking my goals, tracking my yearly, monthly, and weekly goals, but just record keeping for key life metrics. So that's the first stage of a journal. The second thing to do is to make sure you've got a bit of a system so you can find stuff later on. And I find that the bullet journal is a good mechanism for keeping track of things. I don't really completely use the bullet journal method, but I use a lot of those ideas. The next thing then, in particular for your assignments for your career design, is around tracking what gives you engagement, flow, energy, and happiness. And I'm tracking these things in particular because very often we're not aware of the things that give us engagement and flow and energy, and yet these are precisely the kinds of activities and events and people that you want to understand in more detail, because this is part of the divergent thinking phase of the first diamond, where you're trying to accumulate data. You're trying to find out what are some of the things and people and activities that get me excited about going to work, and things that I want to make sure that I build into my career. So we're often not aware of the things that give us energy or engagement or flow, but if you start to track these things on a day-to-day basis, then this is the source of data that you can use to develop these insights in the convergent thinking phase. So basically you should track this, and I suggest here a simple dial. It could be 1 to 10. It could be from negative to positive, like negative energy versus positive energy. It doesn't really matter, and there's a bunch of tools out there. There's lots of good literature around this topic out there, and so you can find what works for you. This is just a simple dial indicator that I use, and if something's giving me flow, I give it a special check mark. Like, this is something I want to really say, wow, I really love doing this kind of thing. Another thing that you should be tracking in your journal is not just what you like doing or what you hate doing, but also track what you're spending your time on. It doesn't have to be like billable hours, but just what are you spending your time on a day-to-day basis? How much time do you waste doing things that aren't important versus things that you do spend doing that are important? So you might think that you spend a lot of time, for example, studying. But if you start to actually track your time, you might realize you spend a lot more time watching TV than you spend studying. Unless watching TV is particularly important to you, maybe you could dial down the amount of time you spend on Facebook or hanging out with your friends, and maybe more time on things that are of higher value to you. That if you're not aware of what you're spending your time on, then you tend to fritter it away. And you should also track who you're spending your time with and whether those particular people are good for you or kind of neutral. That if you're spending time hanging around people that are complaining and unhappy about life and demotivating and not in harmony with your deepest values, then maybe you might want to rebalance the people you're spending your time with or the things that you're spending your time on. So again, this is part of the divergent thinking phase. You're just accumulating data. You're not necessarily evaluating the data yet. You're just, think of it as an explorer. You're trying to discover yourself and what's interesting and important to you that will help drive some important career and life decisions. Another tool I wanted to introduce to you is the idea of the 5 whys. That when you say, well, this made me happy, that's kind of a superficial thing. But if you say, well, why did it make me happy? Well, it made me happy because of this. Well, why did it do that? Well, why did it do that? Why did you do this? That if you kind of sort of keep on asking the why until you get to the 5th why, very often that 5th why is like, aha, this is what really was the insight that drove why I found this so enjoyable or so disturbing, or why this particular thing triggers me and these things don't trigger me. So here's an example of a potential dashboard layout you might want to consider in your journal, that you would write down, this is the activity that I did, or the people I was with, or the objects I was working, or the environment that I was in, and did it give me engagement or not? Did it give me energy or not? Did it give me happiness or not? Did it give me flow or not? Things like that. So for each of these tools, I'm suggesting a divergent and convergent series of actions. So starts with buying a journal and picking a system, then tracking your energy, engagement, flow, happiness, and things like that. Don't forget to just track the things that are happening to you now in your current life, but also kind of mine some of your prior experiences, that you can spend some time saying, well, introspecting some things that really made me happy in the past, I was doing these things, or things that really gave me flow in the past, I was doing these other things. That's probably particularly true in the era of COVID-19, because you're probably doing a lot fewer things than you used to do. So you might not have the same diversity of activities and events and people these days as you might have in the past. So be sure not just to track what's happening in your current life, but also spend some time kind of digging through your memories and finding what are some of the kind of highlights of my life that I want to try to make sure I get into a Post-it note in order to help that drive my decision making around a possible career path. So track what you're doing in terms of the time that you're spending, track that in the journal. And this is probably going to take a minimum of 2 weeks, probably more like 3 weeks, to be tracking all this information and compiling this data. But don't forget to then take stuff out of your journal and put it into Post-it notes, so in different colors, so that you can then use these Post-it notes to rearrange things and look for patterns, which is the next thing, to look for patterns, to cluster, separate, label, add new Post-it notes, things that are similar put together, things that are very different, maybe use different colors, and separate. I'm then going to suggest, as part of your convergent thinking phase, consider the AEIOU framework. This is an analysis of what are the activities, environments, interactions, objects, or users or people that give you these events, that give you this energy or lack of energy. You can use a variety of 2x2 matrices. You could plot things like things that you like versus things that you spend your time doing. You might find some interesting things there, that you waste time doing things that you don't even like doing, that you just do it out of habits. Or you could track things like things you spend your time on versus whether it's good for you or not so good for you. And you might find some interesting insights from that as well too. So I don't want to dictate specifically which matrices to use, which 2x2 things to use, which things to track, because each person is different. And also, I'd love to learn from you, that maybe you can find some new things that I hadn't thought of before that I can share with future year students as well too. So hopefully each year, as we build this community of inquiry and we're working together in a peer-to-peer as well as peer-to-professor way, that I'm learning from you as much as you're learning from me, and you're learning from each other. You then want to capture your learnings in some kind of a reflection that could either be written or in terms of documenting or photographing your matrices. And be sure to take photographs of your work. Lastly, I'd like to remind you that if you'd like for me to provide you with feedback publicly in class in week 2, I guess this will be week 3, I guess we're talking about the dashboard, then be sure to upload this to D2L at least 24 hours in advance. And that if you do that, you're giving me permission to share this information with other people as well. I'm sharing a lot of information with you, and I realize that is that providing that authentic, trusting environment in this community of inquiry is a little scary sometimes. And so I'm sharing some of my information with you as well too. So, thanks for joining. Enjoy working on understanding a little bit more about what makes you tick. And remember, entrepreneurship is like learning how to play the guitar. Crank it up to 11.